suffrage movement was a group of mostly women that fought for equal social, political, and financial status of women. The movement began during the Revolutionary War and went through the late 1920s. The women that participated in the movement often went to jail, while some were even killed. Many women were taken away from their children while imprisoned, and others had their children taken away due to the wilderness they were caught. It took nearly 100 years for women to gain equal rights.
In August of 1832, the first petition on women's suffrage was presented to the members of the British Parliament. Henry Hunt, MP, presented this petition asking for the vote for women. On August 3rd, they became the first women's suffrage petition. In January of 1867, the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage is formed in Britain. Elizabeth Wolstenholme claimed it had begun in 1865. Lydia Becker was a secretary for the MNSWS, and Richard Pankhurst was a member of the committee. Many other societies in different cities were formed across Britain. In April of 1868, the MNSWS held their first ever public meeting at the Manchester Free Trade Hall to discuss the issues of women's suffrage. The Manchester Free Trade Hall purpose was to commemorate the Corn Laws in 1846. In December of 1870, the Married Women's Property Act granted married women the right to own property and money. Before the movement, women that made or received money was automatically given to the husband once she is married. With the new rights, women were allowed to own their own property and money. This law was one step closer to women getting the right to vote, which meant that the suffragettes' hard work was paying off. In December of 1894, the Local Government Act is passed, allowing single and married women the right to vote in county and borough elections. In 1897, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies is formed, uniting.
In October of 1903, the Women's Social and Political Union is formed at the home of Emmeline Pankhurst in Manchester. Emmeline Pankhurst was a British suffragette. She was notorious for going on and starting hunger strikes. Her husband, Richard Pankhurst, was a women's rights advocate. Her two daughters, Christabel and Sylvia, were also active in the women's suffrage movement. As the daughter of Emmeline Pankhurst, Christabel was also a British suffragette. She was the co-founder of the Women's Social and Political Union, and her mother was the founder of the union. In June of 1908, the largest political rally in Hyde Park, London, was held. This rally was known as Women's Sunday. Up to 500,000 men and women attended the event from all over the country, while nearly 30,000 women marched up to Hyde Park. In July of 1914, World War I breaks out, causing a suspension to the women's suffrage movement. Women started entering the workforce, which helped the women's movement. In May of 1929, women over the age of 21 were allowed to vote in their first general election. In 1848, the first women's rights convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. The meeting launched the women's suffrage movement here in the U.S. In 1850, over 1,000 people attended the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. More than 1,000 delegates from 11 states attended to the event.
In 1868, Congress ratifies the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment addresses the equal protection and rights of former slaves. In 1869, to the Constitution, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. The primary goal of the organization was to achieve voting rights for women through an amendment. In 1870, Congress ratified the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment gives the right to vote to African men. In 1878, the Women's Suffrage Amendment was introduced to Congress. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association was formed by merging two suffrage associations. Anthony and Stanton merged the two organizations because they wanted to push Congress to approve a federal amendment for the women's suffrage. In 1896, over 100 black women's clubs were brought together when the National Association of Colored Women is formed. Suffragette Mary Church Terrell became the first president of the NACW. In 1916, Alice Paul and her colleagues formed the National Women's Party and began to introduce some of the methods used by the suffrage movement in Britain. The leaders, Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, were members of the NAWSA before they were part of the NWP. In 1819, the Federal Women's Suffrage Amendment was written by Susan B. Anthony and is introduced to the Congress in 1878 and is passed by the House of Representatives. On August 29, 1920, the 19th Amendment is passed to the Constitution, granting women the right to vote. A representative named James R. Mann proposed the House resolution to approve the amendment. Elizabeth was an abolitionist and a leader figure of the early women's movement. During the Civil War, Elizabeth only wanted to abolish slavery, but afterwards she became even more involved in promoting women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton held the famous Seneca Falls Convention along with Lucretia Mott and several other women. In 1868, she worked with Susan B. Anthony on the Revolution. They then formed the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869. Susan B. Anthony was a suffragette and she worked with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and joined the women's movement in 1852. Susan was a temperance worker and brought up the problem of drunkenness and how it affected families. She also stood against the dress reform and went on strike. Susan wore the same romper for a year and cut her hair. Lucretia Mott was an abolitionist and a Quaker. She met Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Anti-Slavery Convention and became a women's rights advocate. Stanton and herself both organized conventions for women's rights. The women's suffrage movement has changed the perspective of what women can achieve. It has shown us that if we work hard for what we believe in, we can achieve the goal of ours. After the movement, women began to step up and be who they want to be. Women began to join the military or open up their own businesses and even run for office positions, and so forth. In 2016, Hillary Clinton became the first ever female presidential candidate. In the 2018 midterm elections, 102 women were elected to represent the U.S. government. Democrats elected 89 women, while the Republicans elected 13. This marks history of the most female candidates to join the U.S. Congress, and we refer to the historical event as the Year of the Women. Sarah Thomas is the first ever female to become a full-time official NFL referee and ref at the 2019 playoffs. She started off being a referee for college football, and on April 8, 2015, Sarah was offered to become a referee for the NFL Football League, and she was honored to take the job.